Lassert's nomination to lead the Department of Energy isn't just another routine hearing in Washington. On paper, it should have been straightforward: a qualified nominee, a committee asking questions, and then a vote. But what actually unfolded was something much bigger: a high-stakes conversation about whether America is prepared to confront its energy future honestly, or whether politics will keep steering the country into denial. Beneath the polished language of senators and the calm tone of the nominee, the stakes couldn't be higher: skyrocketing demand for electricity, a grid that can't keep up, and a fight over whether regulators are truly independent or just puppets of whichever administration happens to be in power. The first flashpoint came from a question most Americans don't think about, but one that defines the very structure of the energy market: independence.
Barrasso. Senator King, you're up to bat next.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lassert, I'm a little confused. Senator Lee asked you the question about the Humphreys executive decision, and you seem to indicate that you felt that the president would and should have the power to fire a FERC commissioner. Is that your position?
No, my Senator, thank you for the question. My position is that we'll follow the law, and if the Supreme Court of the highest court in the land changes that law, then we'll follow that too.
Well, it's hard for me to imagine how the president having the power to fire commissioners could then you could still call the commission independent. That, to me, is an ultimate compromise. Let's talk about the central reality that we're facing today, which has been mentioned several times, and that is the incredible increase of demand of electricity. The chairman in the last hearing that we had indicated some data that we're looking at 2% a year increase in demand. Over 10 years compounded, that's a 30%. That's a staggering increase. The question is, there are two issues. One is the power availability, and the second is time. How soon can it come? Ms. Sweat, what's the cheapest form of electricity generation today in the country?
Thank you for the question, Senator. I have not looked into that issue, but I am happy to look into it and answer any questions.
Well, I'll help you. It's wind and solar by a mile, by a factor of 2. The fellow who left here under difficult circumstances actually was correct. The cheapest form of energy today are wind and solar by a long shot. Do you know, let's take a case study, Iowa. Any idea how much wind power supplies to the economy of the electricity supply of Iowa?
No, sir, I don't know those specific numbers.
60%. Iowa is the 15th lowest electricity cost in the country, and in the past year, as we've already learned, average electricity prices across the country have gone up between 6 and 10%. In Iowa, it's actually gone down 0.5%. The point is, you both have talked about being agnostic. I hope you'll hold to that, because we can't ignore the reality around us that this administration is extremely hostile, and that's a mild term, to renewable energy. And yet, and the second point, as I've talked about price, is speed. There's no question that wind and solar are the quickest to deploy. Senator Heinrich mentioned if you wanted a new gas turbine plant today, it would be about 7 years between permitting and the fact that there's a 5-year wait time for a turbine. A major solar project can go online in a year and a half. So I just hope that you all will be true to your word today and not follow what amounts to an ideology that says we can't have wind and solar. Mr. Lassert, will you commit to being agnostic as to energy sources and focus entirely on reliability, cost, and availability?
Senator, the Federal Power Act requires that a commissioner be neutral in those decisions, and I commit to following the law.
And I think I want to emphasize again, speed is an issue here. This demand growth that we're seeing is going to be taking place in the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years. We don't have 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years to somehow conjure electrons out of the sky. Actually, we can conjure them out of the sky if we're talking about solar power. So the second issue, we're talking about supply, is the grid. The grid is not prepared for this increase in demand. And one of the concerns I have is the cost of expanding the grid to meet this demand is going to be gigantic. And we have to be sure that that the expansion of the grid is done in a cost-effective way, and that's where FERC comes in, and that's where what I call GETS, grid-enhancing technologies, come in. Ms. Sweat, talk to me about utilizing grid-enhancing technologies as opposed to simply building in the old way and adding this cost to the consumers.
Thank you for the question, Senator. I fully share your sentiment that we should be maximizing the resources that we already have, including the existing grid. And as someone who has represented transmission owners in the past, I understand the technology behind that and the potential benefits that can be realized from GETS.
But you also understand, if you've done that kind of representation, that it's the incentive to the transmission owner is to build, not do the low-cost, no-cost improvements. And therefore, I think FERC has to think about how do we incentivize the adoption of these technologies, because letting the market play as it normally would, where the transmission owner has the incentive to actually build rather than make the grid more efficient. So I hope you'll bear that in mind.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, I understand that transmission incentives have been heavily litigated at FERC, and FERC has been facing those very difficult issues for many years. And I commit to you that I will take a hard look at any of those related matters if they come before me, if I am confirmed.
My time has expired, but very quickly, I hope you both, assuming you're confirmed, and that's up to the committee and the Senate, take a serious look at the interconnection queues at the RTOs. Remember we talked about time. The average wait in many RTOs around the country is 5 years, and that is unacceptable. And some of the RTOs are now talking about using AI in the analysis, the engineering analysis for interconnection. I think that's got to be part of the solution. Again, time is our enemy here. If we don't meet this demand, we're going to see some very negative consequences. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A senator pressed Lassert about whether the president should have the authority to fire commissioners at will. For years, these positions have been considered insulated, designed to prevent political pressure from skewing economic and technical decisions. Lassert's response was careful but clear. He said he would follow the law, and if the highest court in the land decided otherwise, he would follow that too. But then he added a line that cut deeper than any soundbite: if commissioners can be removed at will, how can the commission call itself independent? Once independence is gone, decisions about the nation's energy aren't grounded in law or economics anymore, they're dictated by raw politics. That one answer reframed the entire hearing, but independence wasn't the only issue on the table. Just as critical, maybe even more urgent, is the reality of America's exploding electricity demand. Lassert spelled it out with brutal clarity: demand is rising at about 2% per year. Compound that growth over a decade, and it adds up to around 30% more power needed to keep the lights on. That's not some distant theoretical future, it's happening now, driven by the rapid expansion of data centers that run everything from artificial intelligence to cloud storage, the accelerating adoption of electric vehicles, and the push to bring heavy industry back to American soil. All of these developments are energy hungry, and the timeline is merciless. As Lassert warned, we don't have 2 or 3 decades to figure this out. We're staring down the barrel of an energy crunch within just a handful of years. Time, he said, is our enemy. And then came the moment that many in the room didn't want to hear. When asked about the cheapest source of power today, Lassert didn't flinch. It's wind and solar, he said, by a factor of 2. For years, opponents of renewable energy have argued that it's too expensive, too unreliable, too much of a dream cooked up by environmentalists. But Lassert brought receipts. In Iowa, more than 60% of the state's electricity already comes from wind. And while average energy prices across the country climbed between 6 and 10% last year, Iowa's actually dropped by 0.5%. The facts are stubborn: renewables aren't just competitive anymore, they're leading the market. That kind of statement shakes the foundations of political talking points. For decades, the energy debate has been framed as a tug-of-war between cheap and reliable fossil fuels and idealistic, costly renewables, but the economics have flipped. In real time, in actual communities, wind and solar are delivering lower costs and proving the skeptics wrong. That doesn't mean they're perfect. It doesn't mean there aren't challenges. but it does mean the old rhetoric doesn't line up with reality anymore. And Lassert wasn't afraid to say it in front of senators who still cling to that narrative. Yet cost isn't the only dimension that matters. Speed is equally critical, and here again Lassert cut through the noise. If you wanted to build a new gas turbine plant today, you'd be waiting 7 years before a single electron hit the grid. Add in the current 5-year backlog for turbine equipment, and the timeline stretches even longer. In contrast, a major solar project can be up and running in as little as a year or a year and a half. Wind farms, too, are far faster to deploy than nearly every fossil fuel option. When the clock is ticking and demand is soaring, those timelines make all the difference. The conclusion writes itself: if America is serious about meeting its exploding demand, renewables aren't just an option, they're the only realistic choice in the near term. But even speed has its limits, because generating electricity is only part of the equation. The real bottleneck lies in the grid itself. America's transmission system is old, stretched thin, and unprepared for the surge of new power sources waiting to come online. Expanding the grid to meet demand will cost billions, possibly trillions, and consumers will inevitably carry much of that burden. And beyond the cost, there's the bottleneck of bureaucracy. Across the country, projects that could be delivering clean, cheap power are stuck in interconnection queues. On average, they wait 5 years before being connected. That's half a decade of wasted potential, half a decade where communities face rising bills and blackouts while ready-to-go projects sit idle. Lassert didn't mince words. Time is the enemy. There's also the question of incentives. Transmission owners, the companies responsible for building and maintaining the grid, make more money building large, expensive projects than they do from implementing small, efficient fixes. That means they often ignore grid-enhancing technologies that could double the capacity of existing lines at a fraction of the cost. It's a classic example of misaligned incentives, and Lassert was blunt about it. Unless regulators and lawmakers change the rules, America will keep wasting both money and years failing to use the tools already available. This wasn't a message the committee necessarily wanted to hear, but it was one they needed to. Still, Lassert wasn't all doom and gloom. He offered a pragmatic path forward, one rooted in math and engineering rather than ideology. His formula was simple: wind, solar, and fast-deploy gas turbines. It's not a fantasy of a 100% renewable grid overnight, nor is it a retreat into fossil fuel dependency. Instead, it's a balance: reliability, cost, and availability as the guiding principles. That triad may sound boring in an era of grand political slogans, but it's exactly what the debate has been missing. Pragmatism. What makes his stance so striking is that it risks alienating both sides. To fossil fuel hardliners, admitting that wind and solar are now the cheapest option feels like surrender. To environmental purists, including gas turbines in the mix feels like betrayal. But to anyone willing to look at the data, it's the only path that makes sense. This is what realism looks like in the energy debate: not picking sides in a culture war, but choosing solutions that actually work. The testimony ended on a note that made it clear why this nomination matters so much. Lassert wasn't making grand promises. He wasn't pretending the challenges could be solved with the wave of a hand. Instead, he talked about facing the arithmetic of the crisis: exploding demand, a broken incentive structure, and a grid on life support. He pointed out that technology like artificial intelligence could help reduce backlogs in interconnection analysis, but only if regulators are willing to modernize. He emphasized that time is short, and delay has real consequences: rising costs for families, stalled projects for communities, and even the risk of outages as demand outpaces supply. It's rare to hear that kind of honesty in a confirmation hearing. Most nominees play it safe, avoiding controversy and sticking to vague promises. Lassert did something different. He outlined the problem, pointed to real numbers, and demanded that lawmakers see reality for what it is. In doing so, he turned a routine nomination into a referendum on whether America is ready to grow up about its energy choices. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just about one man's career. It's about whether the country can accept that the economics of energy have changed, that demand is rising faster than expected, and that ideology won't keep the lights on. It's about whether regulators will be allowed to stay independent, or whether every decision will be pulled into the orbit of political pressure. and it's about whether America will choose to act in time or whether it will cling to a past that no longer exists until the crisis can't be ignored. The hearing left us with a choice. Will policymakers recognize that wind and solar are not just cleaner but cheaper, that speed of deployment matters, and that the grid must be modernized now? Or will they let politics and outdated assumptions stall progress until families pay the price in higher bills and failing systems? Lassert didn't frame it as ideology, he framed it as law, math and engineering, the three things too often missing in this debate. And that's why his nomination matters far beyond the walls of the Senate chamber. So the question lingers, one that every viewer should think about: will the country finally face reality, or will it continue pretending the old narratives still hold true? The future of American energy hangs on that answer.